Just before the video begins, please subscribe and like the videos to help the channel grow. Also leave a comment, good, bad or indifferent. Thanks for watching.
2 years. How much longer do you give yourself doing this thing, going around being...
I don't know. I never thought I'd be doing it for 2 years even, you know. I think we're sort of pretty well set up for at least another year.
On the morning of the 29th of June 1967, Keith Richards entered the witness box at Chichester Crown Court. 2 days previous, Mick had been tried and found guilty for possession of amphetamine tablets. Keith had bought Mick some fresh clothes and a 184-piece jigsaw puzzle, but now it was his time. The prosecution quizzed Keith on the fact that when Marianne Faithfull was arrested at Keith's house, she was wearing nothing but a fur rug. You would expect a young woman to be embarrassed if she had nothing on but a fur rug in the presence of 8 men, he asked. Not at all, Keith responded. You regard this as quite normal, do you? He pressed. We're not old men. We're not worried about petty morals, Keith snapped. It took the jury just over an hour to find Keith guilty. He was charged with allowing his property to be used for the illegal consumption of cannabis. And for this, Keith was given 12 months and ordered to pay £500 towards the cost of the case. Mick was sentenced to 3 months and ordered to pay £100 in court costs. When the sentence was read, Mick almost collapsed, put his head in his hands and began to cry. Mick was sent to Brixton Prison where he was given his own cell. Sat alone in his cell, Mick wrote the song 2,000 Light Years from Home. Keith was sent to Wormwood Scrubs. Keith's prison job would be to make miniature trees to decorate Christmas cakes. The next day, both men were released on bail. By October, fresh from his one-day prison sentence, Keith was consuming as many illegal substances as possible. He was eaten up with the guilt of stealing Anita Pallenberg from Brian, and he feared that this was what had pushed Brian over the edge. Brian in turn was dating Keith's ex-girlfriend Linda Keith, and in a similar vein, Brian and Linda numbed their emotional pain with drugs. Home at Redlands, Keith ate his favourite meal of eggs and bacon with brown sauce. On cold nights he gazed up into the sky and watched UFOs flying over Redlands. Keith seldom left his estate and he would record material in a cottage on the grounds he called the Fifth Dimension. By April next year, Mick and Marianne were having their first child and Mick was eager for them to get married. Marianne, not so much. After watching a concert together, Mick and Keith drove to Stonehenge where all manners of drugs were consumed. 1968 was remembered fondly by Mick. He stated, "There was a good feeling in the air. Keith had tried to embrace the psychedelic movement, but it never sat comfortably on his shoulders. The epic failure of Satanic Majesties had ended the Stones' flirtation with psychedelia, and with Beggar's Banquet they would return to their roots and release an album that would go down as one of their finest." The cover was originally intended to be a graffiti-covered toilet they saw in Los Angeles, but their record company refused it and insisted they ended up with a blank white album cover that bore a striking resemblance to the Beatles' latest release, the White Album. Their previous album, Satanic Majesties, had also looked very similar to the Sgt. Pepper cover. Brian at this time was wandering around the wilds of Morocco recording the master musicians of Jajuka with a portable Uher tape recorder. Mick during this time was to star in his first acting role in the film Performance. He wrote a song for the film called Memo from Turner. In November, Marianne had a miscarriage. In memo from Turner, Mick added the words, "The baby's dead, my lady said." On the 18th of December, Keith turned 25. He travelled to Peru with Anita, where they were kicked out of a hotel for wandering around shirtless. Keith had took to wearing makeup at this point, and he and Anita considered a pagan marriage. Keith told a newspaper he was interested in voodoo, and people accused Anita of being a witch. By 1969, Mick's girlfriend Marianne had begun using heroin and attempted suicide while Mick began shooting for his second film, Ned Kelly. Marianne later stated, "The worst thing about being with Mick was the rule he laid down that you should never show emotion in case people realised you weren't cool. That year, Brian would drown in his swimming pool. Keith blamed those around him for not looking after him. He stated, everyone knew what Brian was like, especially at a party." The Stones dedicated a concert in tribute to Brian, also to showcase his replacement, Mick Taylor. Mick read a poem by Shelley and released butterflies from cardboard cages into the air. Most of the butterflies had died from the heat, and only a small portion flew into the sky. At this time, Mick began shooting for his next film, Ned Kelly. During filming, he was wounded from a gunshot in his hand, and to make matters worse, performance had been given an X rating, which back in 1969 was the kiss of death. Meanwhile, Keith was having a hard time coping with Brian's death and the guilt which came with it. His way of coping, it seemed, was to become Brian. He embraced the image of the junkie rock star teetering on the verge of death. But no matter how much he mimicked Brian's self-destruction, he never actually fell to pieces. On November 26th, Mick announced in a press conference the Stones would be holding a free concert in Altamont. The concert was being held the same day the Stones would release their latest album, Let It Bleed. The band arrived by helicopter on December 6th. As Mick stepped onto the field, he was punched by a crazed teenager high on acid. Mick then joined Keith and a group of others in a trailer backstage. There were rumblings of the violence being inflicted on the extremely intoxicated crowd. The Stones smoked marijuana and played country songs as they awaited their set. The Grateful Dead got word of what was going on, and as their helicopter landed, they jumped off, thought twice about the situation, climbed back on and left. The band took the stage at 7 p.m. and went straight into Jumping Jack Flash. During the set, fights broke out with pool cues being smashed over audience members' heads. A motorcycle engine blew up and the Angels appeared to be kicking someone to death. Visibly shocked, Mick tried to calm the crazed audience.
Keith, you cool it and I'll try and stop it. Everybody just cool out. Who's fighting and what for?
Keith also tried to put a stop to the chaos by threatening to end the set if the audience didn't calm down.
Look, that guy there, if he doesn't stop it, man. Listen, either those cats cool it, man, or we don't play.
During the chaos, a man was stabbed to death who was waving a revolver. "I wasn't going to shoot you," were his last reported words. Unbeknownst to the Stones, the set carried on. As the last song came to a close, the band began edging closer and closer off stage. With their helicopter waiting, they quickly jumped on and were flown to the safety of their hotel. Altamont was over, and so was the 60s. The Stones' bass player Bill Wyman had stopped talking to Keith by 1970. Keith's dependency on drugs had been the catalyst. Keith had always justified using heroin as a way to relax after a tour, but he would also state, "I think the reason I was taking heroin was to deal with fame and pressure, and it's one way to run away." At this time, he'd began carrying a fountain pen that had been converted to hold 2 grams of heroin. Mick and Marianne finally split in early 1970. Marianne's drug problems had progressed to the point she'd recently fallen asleep in a restaurant after ingesting 5 Quaaludes. Her head had fallen face down into a bowl of soup. Ned Kelly was predictably a flop. The film had been slated through word of mouth even before its release. When Mick watched a preview, he was so depressed he burst into tears. He later stated, "That was a load of shit. I only made it because I had nothing else to do." Much of the criticism of Ned Kelly was unfairly directed at Mick, as if he'd also wrote and directed the picture. By 1971, tax problems ran the Stones out of England. This inspired their later album, Exile on Main Street. After careful consideration, they settled on the south of France as their new home. On April 5, 1971, the band departed for France. A team from the Stones office came to Keith's house, packed everything into cardboard boxes, and shipped it to Saint-Jean-Cap-Ferrat. Keith rented a £1,000 a week seafront villa with the option to buy it for 2 million francs. In just a few weeks, the interior of the Romany Palace would be an unkept, dishevelled mess. Mick took a villa in Saint-Tropez not far from Pablo Picasso. He agreed to star in his next role as Billy the Kid, but nothing materialised. Despite Mick's feelings towards the institution of marriage, in 1971 he married a Nicaraguan actress named Bianca. Recording began for Exile on Main Street, which had the working title of Tropical Disease.
We chose convenience, I suppose, over sound and went for the basement of Keith's house.
Legend has it, the Gestapo used the basement for interrogation as the house had been requisitioned during World War II. The stifling heat saw the group stripped down to their waists. The music was blasted out so loud from the villa you could hear it at the other side of the bay. Recording was agreed to begin at 6 p.m, but it didn't get underway until Keith left his bedroom. This would be somewhere between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. For electricity, roadies ran a cable to the nearby train track and stole the electric from the French National Rail Company. Needless to say, the drug consumption at this time was high. Unlike Keith, Mick was always in control of his drug taking and had always adopted a take-it-or-leave-it attitude. It had now been 10 years since Keith last spoke to his father, and his relationship with Anita was beginning to fall apart. Aside from that, it was permanent party time at the villa, and Keith, as ever, rarely left the grounds. He would occasionally stumble to Nelcote's private beach to paddle with his young son Marlin, named so after the actor Marlon Brando. He had met Brando years earlier when Anita was filming Candy. Brando later said, "Probably the worst film I ever made was Candy." Guests would visit drinking endless bottles of expensive wines where lobster and shrimp would be placed on the table. Such luxuries piled up to the tune of £6,000 a week. From time to time, Keith set sail from Nelcote's private jetty. He owned a speedboat which he drove like a racing car. On more than one occasion, he ran out of fuel and had to be towed back to shore. The party came to an end when Keith's house was burgled and Mick moved back to London. Looking back at his time in France, Mick later stated, "I didn't enjoy it at all. Everyone else liked it, but it was too hot." Police raided Nelcote on December the 14th and found large quantities of heroin, cocaine and marijuana. By March 1972, Keith was in such dire straits he had to be flown to a drug clinic in Switzerland. The pressure on him by the police at this point was relentless. Keith moved to Switzerland later that year, which was a country that catered to rich tax exiles. As he'd done in the past, Keith isolated himself in his new home, attempting to write new music, but it wouldn't be easy. Exile on Main Street had drained his creativity. By 1973, the band had been spending a lot of time in Jamaica. Mick had his long hair cut back to the top of his ears. His wife Bianca was at the time in London filming Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon. Keith was arrested in his home for possession of heroin, quaaludes, marijuana, as well as a shotgun and a revolver. He was fined £205. Later that day, he nodded off after shooting heroin at a party, setting a bed on fire with his burning cigarette. Keith appeared on the Old Grey Whistle test in 1974 high on heroin. He spoke in a quiet tone and looked like he could nod out at any moment. Keith's teeth appeared badly damaged in the interview, and when he returned home to Switzerland, he had extensive dental work done. At this time, Mick and Bianca were renting Andy Warhol's house at a cost of $5,000 a month. The house had its own tennis court, 25 acres of land, and overlooked the Atlantic Ocean. At age 7, Keith's son Marlin followed him everywhere, often sitting with him at bars while Keith knocked back Jack Daniels. The two had become best friends. Keith later said, "He's seen everything. To him, it's not a big deal. It's just something Dad did, but we keep together and we love each other." By 1977, Mick and Bianca's marriage was on the rocks. Bianca soon afterwards filed for divorce. Just over a year later, Keith's love affair with heroin would come to an end, but he continued to use cocaine for the next decade before eventually quitting, sticking to marijuana and cigarettes. In 2022, Keith told an interviewer he'd quit smoking. He stated, "I got a few nicotine patches for a few weeks. Sometimes, a bell rings, something inside says, 'Hey pal, enough,' so I just put the hammer on it." Mick continues daily exercise routines as well as a diet of fresh fruit, veg, whole grains, chicken and fish.
Some guy yells out, "Get your hair cut!" And Mick says, and I'll never forget these words, "What, and look like you?"